I'm going to go over the graphs in AP Macro. You might notice that overall there are more graphs and they technically can go much more deeper than that of Micro. However, one, mainly, all of these graphs are relatively simple. They're easy to understand conceptually. And two, AP Macro, at least the AP exam, only tests you at the surface level for most of these. So overall, many people consider these the easier graphs than that of Micro. So let's first talk about the production possibilities curve. You've probably covered this in microecon, but we also cover it in macro too. This shows a relationship between two different products, product A, wine, and product B, apples, and how much we can produce of them. So let's say we produce only wine. Let's say this number is like 10. That means we produce 10 wines and 0 apples. Or we could produce maybe 10 apples and let's say 20 apples and 0 wine. It shows a relationship between the two. These dots that are on the curve show an in-between between those two options. So A, it could be 5 wine and 4 apples. B could be 3 wine and 7 apples. C could be 1 wine and 10 apples, etc., etc. You see that the dots on the line, those are efficient. That's maximizing our resources. If you have a dot inside of the graph, like D here, that's inefficient. Why? Because hypothetically you could be producing, let's say, 5 wine, 5 apples, but instead you're producing 1 wine, 5 apples. So you see how it's inefficient. It's not producing the most we possibly can. Then point F is simply impossible. Why? Because it's beyond our graph. Here we're producing, let's say, 10 apples and 20 wine, when the max we can produce is maybe maximum amount of wine we can produce is maybe 5. So it just goes beyond the production possibilities curve. There's also a linear PPC. This is because it has a linear opportunities cost, which we covered in Unit 2 of Micro. It will be linear if they are related. So here we see a linear PPC, cakes and cookies, or t-shirts and hoodies. Two products that are related will have a linear PPC, mainly because the opportunity cost is linear because of substitution and because of substitution effect. If you see a graph like this, something concave, curvy, that means the two products are not related. So in this example, it's apples and wine. Another, it could be cars and let's say TVs, two unrelated products. The curve can shift outwards if there's economic growth, innovation, productivity, or simply you can produce more of a good. So in this example, let's say you could produce more cakes, but not necessarily more cookies. That means cakes is going to go up. But economic growth generally increases both. So now we're going to do a few practice problems. Answer these in your head or pause the video, and we're going to cover them in maybe 10 seconds. Now that you probably covered them or tried to answer them, let's look at number 5. Which of the following events could have caused this shift into PPC? A common mistake that a lot of students make is that, they see that the graph is shifted to the right. That means it's growing. That means it's an increase in economic growth. However, you have to notice that you're not necessarily producing more robots. Robots aren't increasing, corn is increasing. So if corn is the only thing that can shift, that means we're just producing more corn, not more robots. If there was an increase in economic growth, both of these products we would produce more of. So B is the actual answer, better farming equipment. Why? Because you can produce more corn, but not necessarily more robots. Then on 3, based on the comparison of point X, Y, and Z, the opportunity cost of an additional consumer good, the answer here is C. Mainly because that's the point next to the consumer goods. We see here that if we go from Z to here, that has a huge opportunity cost. It's a huge jump and decrease. So whatever is the most increase or decrease has the most opportunity cost. At X, we have the lowest opportunity cost. At Y, we kind of have in the middle. So the answer here would be C. Then one last question. That's not really a PPC. It's actually a chart that I've seen a few questions on overall. Based on the comparison of A, B, C, D, and E, the opportunity cost of an additional robot at point D is, I'll give you a few seconds, So for this, we see that pizzas and robots. Overall, when you're calculating opportunity cost, you look at the next preceding unit. So here it would be E. 0 minus 10, we have 10. So the opportunity cost here is 10, because if you produce one more robot, you lose 10 more pizzas. Now let's talk about the circular flow model, the first main topic of AP Macro. The circular flow model kind of explains how our entire economy is related. So here we see households, a product market, businesses, and factor market. The households provide resources to the factor market by their labor, working, jobs. All of that helps the factor market produce goods. Then businesses buy those goods. That's the inputs here. The businesses put those goods onto the product market. Things like Walmart, Amazon, places where you buy goods are the product market. And then households can get those goods. So it's a circular flow. Everything is flowing. Then there's another layer to this. The factor market, because you're working a job, gives you an income. Households spend that money on those same goods. Then the product market gives revenue to businesses because the businesses gave them the product, and then the businesses pay the factor market. It's all related. Something that's not shown in this image is the government. Imagine a big government building in the middle of all of this. The government basically deals with all of this. It regulates all of these change, it taxes all of these different people, but also provides securities and benefits. So overall, the entire economy is related, and you can think of this model really. Then we also have the business cycle, which is pretty simple. The businesses and the economy grow in cycles almost. So at first we have expansion. So here economic growth is high, but also inflation's starting to increase, unemployment's starting to decrease overall. Peak is the maximum point that an economy reaches. This means that if you remember from AP Macro Unit 2, that cyclical unemployment is at 0%. This is our natural rate of unemployment, if you remember what that is. Economic growth has reached its maximum, unemployment's at its lowest, etc., etc. Then we reach a recession. Recession's when economic growth starts to decrease or go into the negatives. Unemployment starts to increase. Inflation starts to decrease, actually, because the economy is not growing as much. Depression goes even worse. Trough, that's the lowest point in an economy. Things are really bad here. Recovery is when our economy starts to grow again, and etc., etc. It's basically a cycle, almost like the circular flow, where we see expansion, peak, recession, depression, trough. Just make sure you understand how these affect different factors, like how it affects economic growth, how it affects interest rates, things like that. Now let's go on to aggregate demand and aggregate supply. It's our basic graph here. We see aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply. On the short run, aggregate supply is just like a regular supply curve. It's a upward sloping curve. In the long run, it's a straight line just like this. On the x-axis, we have real GDP. On the y-axis, we have the price level. You might notice that two main gaps we see here. These gaps show that there's something going on in the macro economy. The inflationary gap shows that the economy is growing way too fast compared to the long-run aggregate supply. And we can see an inflationary gap based on the model. It's aggregate supply and aggregate demand are to the right of aggregate supply. That shows you that there's an inflationary gap. The opposite is true for recessionary gap. If it's behind the long-run aggregate supply, that means that it's actually producing less than it's needed and the economy's kind of going slow. So those are your two main gaps. You do also have to understand how you can actually fix these gaps using fiscal and monetary policy. Now let's talk about the money market. The money market kind of shows the money demand and money supply of money overall in an economy. On the x-axis, we have the quantity of money. On the y-axis, we have the nominal interest rate. Make sure you note this. The money market graph is a nominal interest rate. Money demand, just like every other demand curve, is a downward sloping curve. Money supply is a straight line. Why? Because it doesn't really change. No matter what happens, it's really a straight line. Sure, the federal government can print more, shift it to the right, or possibly shift it to the left, but it's not an upward sloping curve. It's mostly stagnant no matter what the interest rate is. So make sure you remember this. Then we have our loanable funds market. Make note that this is on the y-axis we have the real interest rate, not the nominal interest rate. That is really key. Money market nominal, loanable real interest rate. And then on the x-axis we have quantity of loanable funds. This shows that the supply and demand of loanable funds. So it's very simple. This is supply, this is demand of loans. What can shift the demand is changes in borrowing from consumers. So if people want more loans, or low interest rates are lower, that could increase demand. Businesses, if they want more capital, and the government, when they deficit spend or increase government spending, all of that can increase demand. Then we can shift the supply. If there's an increase in savings, that can decrease loanable funds. If there's a change in foreign investment, let's say there's more foreign investment, that can increase loanable funds and much more. So this is the loanable funds market. Then we have the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve shows the relationship between inflation and unemployment, and you kind of see it in this graph. In the short run, there's a relationship between inflation and unemployment, and we've seen this time and time again in the real world. In 2020, for instance, during COVID, we saw really, really high unemployment. I believe in the US we saw 8-9% at one point, but inflation was really low. In fact, there was points where inflation was negative. So that's this point right here, a recessionary gap, because the economy is going really slow. Unemployment is really high, but inflation is really low. Then a few years later, we kind of saw the opposite of this. Inflation was really high, I think 6-7%, but unemployment was relatively low, 3-4%. So that's kind of the opposite. So in the short run, you can kind of see that they're inverses. You can either have high inflation, low unemployment, or high unemployment, low inflation. In the long run, what we see in the LRPC line here is that there's no relationship between inflation and unemployment. That is really key. It doesn't matter what inflation is. You could have high inflation, high unemployment, or low inflation, low unemployment. In the long run, all of those combinations are possible. Now, the final graph we see in AP Macro is the foreign exchange graph, which shows the currencies of different countries. So you can see there's two main graphs we have here. On the x-axis, we have the quantity of that specific currency, and then on the y-axis, we have the currency in particular. Here we have the euro, I believe. So here it kind of shows the supply and demand of specific currencies. Here's the supply and demand of the dollar, and then here's the supply and demand of the euro. So let's say that, for currencies, if a currency appreciates, the other currency depreciates. It's not like both currencies can appreciate, and both currencies can't depreciate. If one currency appreciates, the other currency depreciates. You need to make note of that. So let's say the dollar appreciates, it gains more value. That means there's more demand for the dollar, so demand increases. But then we see that actually impacts the euro. Why? Because if the dollar appreciates, the euro depreciates. So the supply of the euro increases because less people want euros. The people with the dollars are going to go spend dollars. They're not going to exchange it for euros. Now you understand at least all the necessary graphs on the AP Macro exam. There are a few more niche graphs we didn't really cover that you can cover in your free time. However, these graphs can almost guarantee that you get a 5.